Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So we are in week 4 and in the middle of our discussion of the history of the musical theatre as a genre. I hope you have watched Hair and Cabaret, as I asked you. Film versions are fine, so if you have not, perhaps consider watching them before I start talking about these two specific musicals. But generally, what I would like to talk about today is the golden years of Broadway, the 50s, 60s and 70s. So the end of the traditional musical, of the Broadway type, and the beginning of a new kind of musical, that is the rock musical. So a new type of music enters the musical theatre in the 60s. If you watched Hair, you know what I mean. So there are lots of interesting shows from this period. Some of the shows that we are going to discuss in greater detail in the coming weeks, such as West Side Story and My Fair Lady and Fiddler on the Roof, Hello Dolly, what else? Jesus Christ Superstar, Sweeney Todd, Annie. These are Evita. These are all the titles of the shows from the 50s, the 60s and the 70s. Some of them are quite traditional, quite conservative or even nostalgic, even though they were very successful and very original artistically. The shows like My Fair Lady or Hello Dolly or Fiddler on the Roof, some of them are completely groundbreaking in terms of their form and perhaps even more their contents, or perhaps the combination of both the form and the contents. Such a game changer that basically changed the musical theatre forever was West Side Story. Another such musical was Hair, probably. And then in the 70s, I would say Jesus Christ Superstar was a game changer. Possibly Sweeney Todd was a game changer, but there are very many interesting titles if you want to explore further than this narrow, of course, selection that we are going to focus on in greater detail. So from the 1950s, for example, some of the titles you may recall from last week. But the titles like Guys and Dolls, Singing in the Rain, Bandwagon, Funny Face. These are musicals definitely worth watching. If you find you like this kind of style, you'll probably find lots and lots more. The 50s are the golden age of Rodgers and Hammerstein musical, culminating or ending their wonderful parade of hits with The Sound of Music. This was the last musical of this duo, because unfortunately Oscar Hammerstein died shortly after writing the lyrics to The Sound of Music, which premiered in 1959. Then from the 60s, beyond the titles that we are going to discuss in greater length, titles like probably Sweet Charity or The Man of La Mancha or Thoroughly Modern Millie, just to name a few. these are not second-rate musicals. These were very successful musicals. We just don't have time to talk about each of them at greater length. If there is something you would like to discuss at greater length, we can do it during the live meeting, so put your suggestions on the forum. Then from the 70s, Chicago, Company, Follies, A Little Night Music, The Rocky Horror Show, A Chorus Line, Godspell. These are all innovative, wonderful musicals that very much deserve your attention, and which I strongly encourage you to explore on your own. So I will not focus too much today on the shows that we are going to discuss at a much greater length. For example, West Side Story from 1957, which marks also the debut, only as a lyricist this time, but the debut of a splendid, wonderful and still ongoing career of one of the greatest creative talents of the American musical theater, that is Stephen Sondheim. He wrote the lyrics to West Side Story, to Leonard Bernstein's music, and the book by Arthur Lawrence. This was an incredible, innovative show that opened completely new grounds to the musical theater. So let's remember it now, because it's in this, let's say, middle phase of the development of the musical theater. But we'll discuss it later on. So what we have are some debuts of wonderful creators of the musical theater. So besides Sondheim, we might talk about Hal Prince, the recently deceased theater director who collaborated with Sondheim, with Andrew Lloyd Webber, with many other great shows, and he could be seen as one of the best musical directors of all time. Another name, the man who's again no longer alive, Bob Fosse. We'll talk about Bob Fosse. He's the man who directed the film version of Cabaret, and many other things, including Chicago, for example, and Sweet Charity. He was initially a performer, dancer, an actor and dancer, but he expanded his career to become a choreographer and a director, and he developed a very characteristic style of dancing and style of choreography that you can actually, if you know what to look for, you can identify at a glance. First of all, he liked playing with hats. The dancers he choreographed very often wore hats. He liked wearing hats when he danced on stage. In one interview he said it was because he started losing his hair at a relatively young age, and he was stressed by it, and he tried to counteract the effect by wearing hats. Another thing is the hands. He very often uses gloves, white gloves, and he uses the effect that has been called jazz hands. So kind of outstretched palms and dancing with outstretched palms like this. This became something of a trademark of Bob Fosse. He produced many theatrical shows, Sweet Charity and Chicago. If you watch, even the film version is very much inspired by Fosse's choreography. Or Pippin, another very interesting show from the early 70s. So that's a very interesting creative talent. Recently, I think a few months ago, there was a biopic, a mini-series about him called Fosse Verdon. Gwen Verdon was his long-time collaborator and wife. She was a dancer as well. If you would like to see her at her best, probably watch a film version of another slightly less known musical called Damn Yankees, where she plays a kind of femme fatale, a sexy devil woman called Lola. And if you don't feel like watching the entire film, which is interesting, which is like a version of a Faust story about a man having a pact with the devil to regain his youth, and just look up the song, Whatever Lola Wants, Lola Gets. Here you have Gwen Verdon playing this seductress, but playing her in her very own personal style, as a kind of half devil, half child, to quote Kipling. So very interesting man and very interesting career. You might want to see another film musical directed by Bob Fosse, being a kind of autobiography of him. The title is All That Jazz, and it's about a man who works as a theatre director, a choreographer, so it's basically based on Bob Fosse himself, and it's quite touching, especially if you know that he died young of heart attack, because the main character, spoiler alert, yes, experiences the same in this film. So we have Sondheim as well. So West Side Story started his career as a lyricist. He very quickly went to write music as well and to collaborate with Hal Prince, who would direct his musicals. The first project for which Sondheim wrote both music and lyrics was a kind of comedy set in ancient Rome called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum. And some of my friends who are specialists in the history of ancient Rome say that the film version of this musical is probably one of the best renditions of ancient Rome on film ever. The material is based on real ancient comedies by the author called Plautus, and it's a funny, slightly romantic, slightly slapstick style comedy about ancient Romans, basically. An interesting thing is that in the film version, I guess this was the debut of Michael Crawford, the man who later, a few years later, starred in Hello Dolly and then originated the role of the Phantom of the Opera, and this was like the crowning achievement of his career. So then Stephen Sondheim went on to produce many shows. Not all of them were successful. This is something that we will return to probably a few times during this semester. The artistic philosophy of Stephen Sondheim, the way that he uses the musical theatre to experiment and to introduce new grounds, not really thinking so much about the commercial success, even about the critical success. So some of his shows were flops. They did not last long on stage. The public did not want to buy tickets. They didn't sell very well, but many of them were rediscovered in time in revivals. Probably the best example here is the musical entitled Merrily We Roll Along, which tells the story from the end to the beginning. So we meet a group of 3 friends who are no longer friends, who are not on speaking terms with each other, and we learn what happened, what drove the wedge between them, and we go back in time eventually to the moment when they are all of them young, hopeful, full of talent and optimism, and they want to become the creators of the musical theatre, basically. So perhaps there is a bit of autobiography here. He experimented with the concept musical formula, probably the most successful and the one that has been also acclaimed critically and revived many times is Company from 1970, about a man entering his middle age and starting to think about whether or not he should settle down, he should marry. He has a few girlfriends to choose from, but he's not quite convinced whether or not he should marry. So he invites some married friends over for his 35th birthday party and asks them about their experience with marriage. So there is a plot, but it's not really the main thing. So the musicals by Stephen Sondheim were a little bit in opposition to this integrated book musical formula that was so successful with Rodgers and Hammerstein. So we have stories that do not really focus on the narrative, like Company, like Follies, which is like a kind of concept musical set in a crumbling 30s theatre, and some actors who performed on stage of this theatre gather for the last time to have a last party in the building before it's demolished. Some other things more in the 70s, because well, Sondheim basically he's still active and he wrote a lot. A Little Night Music, which is a story set in the 19th century, but the idea behind it is that all the songs are waltzes. It's a musical about waltzes, basically. Another very, I would say, original and difficult. His musicals are not the easiest to watch. Pacific Overtures, about the beginning of international trade contacts in 19th century Japan. And then some grand things like Sweeney Todd, Sunday in the Park with George, which was inspired by a painting, and Into the Woods, which is like a combination of different tropes from fairy tales, taken in a very interesting psychological perspective. So this is the work of Stephen Sondheim. He starts his career then in the 50s and never stops. He turned 90 a few months ago, and he's still active. There are many documentaries featuring him and recorded interviews. He's quite an outgoing person. We'll talk about him more. Another name that you may want to remember, Jerry Herman, another very successful, although less experimental creator, composer of the musical theatre. We will watch his probably most successful musical together called Hello Dolly from 1964. But he had a string of successful shows in a similar vein, really. Traditional melodious musicals with very hummable music, so kind of catchy tunes. And another show called MAME, M-A-M-E, about a young boy who is raised by his eccentric aunt, and he travels with his eccentric aunt. Then probably his most important achievement, something that earned him a Tony at last, La Cage aux Folles, 1983, which is based on a French film and set in a drag queen cabaret. It's kind of romantic comedy, very strongly and very positively featuring the gay couple. So if you watch this documentary series about Broadway, there are some excerpts from these shows and very interesting observations, for example about La Cage aux Folles. This really continues until the beginning of the 70s and the advent of rock music. We have some more talent, another duo of composer and lyricist, Kander and Ebb. Kander and Ebb, they follow in the tradition of Rodgers and Hammerstein and even possibly Gilbert and Sullivan. John Kander, the composer, and lyricist Fred Ebb. Mostly remembered for Cabaret, that we are going to discuss today, and Chicago, but they also had other interesting shows like Zorba or Kiss of the Spider Woman, or a kind of homage show to Bob Fosse called Fosse. They collaborated with Bob Fosse a lot. He choreographed and directed their Cabaret and their Chicago and some other shows that they did. In 1999 they wrote a show featuring mostly fragments, the best fragments from the shows they worked on together. These are also the people behind a very successful film musical from the 70s, New York, New York, with Liza Minnelli. So this is quite interesting, and in the 60s some things happen, and the most important thing that happens, and it really changes the outlook of the musical theatre, is probably Vietnam War. This is something that will be recalled in Hair, a very contemporary musical, using a very contemporary theme and very contemporary music to attract a completely new audience. The audience of young people for whom the great American songbook, I hope you checked that, is no longer the music they listen to all the time. They have their own music. They have the music of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and other rock artists, and the musical theatre is starting to respond to that. For a while, especially in the 60s, to some extent in the 70s, these two types of musical, so the traditional musical, this musical in the style of the Great American Songbook, continues. For example, in A Little Night Music and The Man of La Mancha and Hello Dolly, but there is a growing current of rock musicals, such as Hair, such as Grease, or Jesus Christ Superstar, Evita, Godspell, and in time, by the 80s really, the rock musical takes over, or at least is a force to consider in the musical theatre. But then a new genre really starts to be visible, the mega musicals we are going to talk about next week. But just this week we continue in a moment.